Okay, we are now live. This is the National Security Decision Making Game seminar track at Gen Con. And this is the presentation on the future as seen from the 19th century. We're going to give it just a minute to see if any of our viewers chime in because we're streaming out both to Facebook and YouTube. And just give them a minute because it's a little bit of a lag on that. There we go. We are now seeing folks coming in. So we'll get started. Basically, this presentation is to try to review science fiction that was written in or very near the 19th century, because we have included H.G. Wells and he sort of overlaps. We will take a couple liberties with the time frame, but our focus is basically going to be on science fiction written in the 19th century, with the largest part of the presentation dealing with Wells and Verne, which were by far the most prolific, and both of them were considered the father of science fiction, depending upon which club or group you manage. So I'm going to start out here with our first slide, and we'll get this show moving.
Have we seen,
I mentioned this is our plan.
We haven't seen.
Yeah, I see her. I'll add her in a second.
Okay.
Because she's going to join us, and she dressed in period attire, which is very nice.
Anyone who came in period, we'll try to upload it to our Facebook and or YouTube somehow. Yeah. We'll try to figure out if we could show people if we have enough time at the end. But we got a lot of material to cover.
Very nice, Elizabeth. So at the end of the primary presentation,
Elizabeth here is joining us through a time portal. She's actually talking from the late 19th century in Victorian era, as you can see.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, please.
Which suburb of
Definitely
London
great to be here.
Lovey? All right. So one of the things we like to give you a background on who it is that you're listening to and what we're all about. We're the National Security Decision Making Game. We're a not-for-profit educational group. We've been around for 30 years. We provide games and seminars on historical, military, and technology topics. Our goal is to learn more about how the world works, and we share the stuff we learned along the way. So we're not really full professionals in the fields that we're talking about, but we're educated amateurs. Our team does, however, have a lot of broad experience. A lot of the team members are former government employees. We have some college professors and academics. We have some people who are active hobbyists, but we've got a lot of folks with wargaming experience. We normally show up at hobby convention, academic, and government venues. We hope to have some more of those in the near future, and those will be posted, those that are public, on our Facebook site. The other thing that we like to point out is all our presentations are based on public information. Nobody's talking classified material, especially for the Victorian era. And all the pictures and so on are under fair use and creative comments. Opinions, errors, or omissions are our own. None of our content should be considered representing any of the people we have work for now, or will work for in the future. Okay. This year,
as far as the classified material goes, some of that stuff Captain Nemo had is still under wraps. Go ahead.
You're not supposed to tell them that. We're now going to have to kill you. Okay. So watch our Facebook page for announcements. We are currently planning to join DragonCon online, where we hope to run at least one game, and we'll have several seminars. We're going to be at Escape Velocity online, which is going to be handled so that they're broadcasting a few hours every evening over the whole month of October. So we'll maybe participating in a couple panels there and anticipate at least one game to be run at that convention. So as we start getting into this, we need to talk about what science fiction is. And my basic role in the presentation is to put stuff in context for you, and then we'll talk in more detail about specifics. Science fiction is a genre of speculative fiction, and it normally uses imaginative and futuristic concepts. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is most science fiction today, and more so in the 19th century, has some moral or intellectual underpinning, that they're talking about social problems and using allegory to carry the story and to get you to think about the way you do things now. Almost all science fiction includes some special advanced technology, space exploration, or whatever. And there is a slight difference between science fiction and fantasy, because science fiction tries to build on things that are plausible versus build on things that are fantastic. The classic elements of science fiction we all see explored for the most part initially in 19th century fiction. The concepts of time travel, teleportation, mind control, telepathy, telekinesis, aliens, space travel, all that stuff, and the evil and mad scientists and inventors, all of those things are basically seen for the most part in the 19th century. Now, some things that we see go way, way back. We're going to have a short talk about the invisible man, okay? And that's a concept that goes all the way back to the Greeks. They had people with invisibility cloaks and rings and could become invisible because they were gods and all those kinds of things. But the difference is the underpinning in science fiction is it's based on what was presumed at the time to be a plausible stretch. Because a lot of the things you'd see were things like Hollow Earth. There was a lot of discussion about lava tubes and access, and the Earth was cooling because they understood some of the geology of volcanoes, but they didn't realize how long it should take for the Earth to turn into a solid rock.
If I may, in addition to the mad or evil scientists, we'll talk about this more with Mary Shelley's work, is the foolish scientist, the what have I done aspect of it, where science creates something and then has to deal with the consequences because maybe science shouldn't. Another interesting definition I've heard, the difference between fantasy and science fiction, is that science fiction is something that is plausible and you might end up wishing it wasn't when you read the story, whereas fantasy is something that is not plausible, impossible, but you might wish that it was. Okay, thanks, Merle.
Okay, no problem. Got to have that mouse on the right screen. Okay. So there's a lot of different things that are involved. We tried to give you some period pictures in our slides. This is the timeline of the 19th century in terms of authors. But we'll talk in a minute about how technology affected what people thought about. So, Mark, do you want to talk about the timeline a little more?
Yeah, we just have a few of the important things here that it's kind of hard to see on this scale. I'm sorry for that. But we have we're showing actually that Jules Verne and H.G. Wells are kind of different in terms of when they were and where they were and who they are. Wells is much later than Verne. In fact, Verne was deep into his publishing when H.G. Wells was born. But we've positioned here also some of the major events and achievements of the time to give you a context of what they were writing for, and what the baseline background was. But we discuss Halley's Comet is on here in two places, at the beginning and the end when Halley's Comet came around. So that gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about here, where this is a 100-year period from 1820 to 1920. Down in the lower right, I have when Queen Victoria died and King Edward took over. So that's the end of the that period. But if we're going from on your slide from left to right, it's Halley's Comet when Neptune was discovered. Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, the U.S. Civil War just about when H.G. Wells was being born, including the Hunley, which I put there because we're talking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and how that might have been influenced. Above, when H.G. Wells was born, Jules Verne was writing Journey to the Center of the Earth, From the Earth to the Moon, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, and Mysterious Island, all in that cluster about when Wells was a kid. Moving on further toward the turn of the century, when Queen Victoria is in her latter years, is when H.G. Wells wrote most of his most famous stuff, also in a cluster, including The Time Machine, Invisible Man, Island of Dr. Moreau, and War of the Worlds. Later on, he became more of an activist in his writing, and we list some things such as War in the Air, and The World Set Free after the turn of the century. After the turn of the century, we also it shows where the Wright brothers, relativity theory, Halley's Comet coming around again, and then World War I toward the end of the plot here. Wells, in fact, passed away in 1946, so he saw the Second World War. He predicted some of the Second World War and the shape of things to come in 1933, which is off the scale here to the right, whereas Verne died I don't list that date. Okay, never mind. Verne died sometime around just around the turn of the century, so he didn't see the First World War. But that's the timeline there. Like, we could put 100 things there. We just get much more busy. I just wanted to put a few things on there to give you a context of what the technology at the times was. This whole thing is industrial revolution. From the start of the industrial revolution, start beginning to use steam to revolutionize the world toward the end. And so that's what I have to say on that, Merle. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things to put this into context is to realize when we talk about the development of science fiction, today we think of ourselves as living in the most change-oriented society in world history, and that's true. But the last century was also the most exciting time in world history for the people that were living it. You have to realize that the tin can wasn't invented until 1804. That's not on my chart, okay? But it's important to understand basic things that are part of our life were things that were brand new and shiny in the period. The Nautilus submarine by Fulton was 1800. The electric battery was 1800. The Jacquard loom. You look at things, the cotton gin was 1807, and the sewing machine 1830. All this stuff is changing. And in 1836, you got the Colt revolver, which is the first device that really used interchangeable parts. And they built a manufacturing line for it in the 40s and the 50s. The telegraph showed up, and vulcanized rubber and anesthesia. All of these things are part of the background of how science fiction was starting to take off. And when we get to Mary Shelley, for example, they were just in science circles talking about the galvanic principles of batteries and electricity. And that's part of how she came up with the idea for the mad scientist in Frankenstein. And as you move into the later half of the century, you start getting things like machine guns and typewriters and the telephone and the phonograph. All these things that are what we think of as the underpinnings of the modern telecommunications and machine world, okay? And then ultimately you move to moving pictures and the automobile and like things that are basic today, like the zipper in 1893. Or what's essential, more important to us that were former bureaucrats, the paperclip in 1899. The other thing that helped fuel this whole thing were the great expositions. Starting in the 1840s and 1850s, they started having scientific and commercial expositions. Think of them as big fairs, bigger than your county fair, bigger than your state fair. And a lot of it was to promote and show off all of this really cool technology. Queen Victoria had the Great Exposition in Hyde Park in London in 1851. And this thing had 13,000 exhibits from 44 countries and 6 million visitors. So about the number of people that went to see that equaled the third of the British population, and all those people weren't British. And the proceeds from that thing, the profits, were used to found 3 museums plus trusts and grants that exist to this day. So that was the big show. That entire process helped spread information through all of the intellectual circles of Europe and basically spawned what we think of today as science fiction. The other thing to realize is Verne went to a couple of these. So that was where he got a lot of his ideas. Now we'll talk about Verne. His career hit stride in 1863. So right about the time of our Civil War, he's the #1 selling author of science fiction. His first really big seller was 5 Weeks in a Balloon. And he kept publishing consistently interesting stuff of a science fiction flavor all the way up till just after the turn of the century. Also, in 1992, I think it was, they discovered a manuscript that his editor rejected that he wrote in 1863, which was Paris in the 20th century, which was finally printed in 1994 in English. So, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Things to understand to put it in context is Verne was born in 1828. He's also the second most translated author in the world. He wrote hundreds of books. There are some very hard to find ones. And I was a big Verne addict in high school and college. So there are things like the Green Ray, which was the search for a special kind of cosmic ray near the Aurora Borealis, as well as things like the Nautilus and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He was originally enrolled in religious schools. At 11, he tried to run away from home and sail to the Indies, but his father caught him at the dock in England. Okay. His parents planned for him to have a career in law, which he sort of rebelled against. And he was in Paris during the 1848 revolution. He was also pretty sick from 1848 on. He had violent cramps from colitis and partial facial paralysis, where he had 4 different attacks after 1851. What's also interesting is when he was in Paris, he started writing. I mean, he'd been writing stories since he was a kid, but he started writing professionally, and he met and collaborated with Alexandre Dumas, the guy that did the Iron Mask stories and all that stuff, and became really good friend with Dumas's son. And he kept collaborating with his son for a number of years. And then in 1861, his 5 Weeks in a Balloon was serialized in a magazine. And then in 1863, it was released as a book. So now we're going to move into specific stories. And this next part I'm going to give to the Submariner because he's our specialist on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea around 1869. It's published in 1870, and in English versions would have been more like 1872. So we're at the 150th anniversary now, which is why I wanted to bring this up. Ooh, I'm having a hard time getting the right thing up here. Okay, so. What we have in the basic story, one of the things that gets confusing when we start talking about some of these very well-known stories is what's actually in the original book that a lot of people haven't necessarily read versus what's been in the movies that is usually how dramatized. They bring out certain things, or they try to bring out morals from the mid-20th century when the author had something else completely different in mind. So I'm going to try to stay true to what the original book was about, and what we're trying to talk to. In the book, there's a Professor Aronnax. The book is written first person as his narrative of what happened to him. And while the book came out in 1870, it was supposed to be, the story was set in 1866 when everything starts. So he's talking about something that happened to him 4 years earlier. He's a respected scientist washed overboard while they're trying to track down a certain creature who is believed to have been responsible for sinking some ships. He's washed overboard from the U.S. frigate with his assistant, a man named Consul, who is an expert in classification of various types of life, including marine life, and a Canadian harpoonist named Ned Land. So Aronnax is upper crust, and these two are working class, blue collar, and that's interesting the way Verne brings that out as something completely natural to him. Anyway, Captain Nemo is in command of the Nautilus that rescues the 3 of them, and he is deeply respectful of Aronnax's work as a scientist, including marine life classification, as he refers to his book a lot, almost daily. And so he offers a spot on board to allow him to pursue his studies, and by implication, of course, he is a prisoner, although he isn't treated as one. So next slide, please. Merle, next slide. Okay, there we go. So the socioeconomic observation, Aronnax, he is an upper class person, and Verne wrote this in the late 1860s. So Aronnax has his own stateroom that's twice the size of the one that Consul and Ned Land are sharing, his two subordinates. Aronnax is his own steward. It's all described by Verne with no indication that there was anything out of the ordinary with this class distinction. That's not something that H.G. Wells might have written about something like that, but he was written in a derogatory fashion, as if this is wrong. This isn't treating someone right. And perhaps it shows a difference between the people, or a difference between the additional Wells being a later generation than Verne. Now, just also of interest, Verne chose the name Nautilus that was inspired by Robert Fulton's Nautilus, built for Napoleon in 1800. Next slide, then. Okay, now Nautilus Dimensions were based, were given it very specifically, and Verne was very methodical and calculational. The Nautilus is 230 feet long by 26 feet in diameter. It's about 1,700 tons submerged displacement. As far as Verne went, his exterior dimensions probably sounded huge to him. In the context of the day, the only successful, quote unquote, submarine at the time had been the Hunley, which was successful because it at least destroyed the ship it was attacking, although it was destroyed in the process. The Hunley was 40 feet long and displaced 7.5 tons. So Jules Verne's Nautilus was huge compared to Hunley. It was also very, very large compared to Plunger. Plunger was a huge submarine, a real submarine at the time, French submarine in 1863, and it was 140 feet long and 420 tons displacement. So Verne's ship is nearly 4 times the size of Plunger. Now, we know Verne saw Plunger, a model of the Plunger, at the second World's Fair, the Paris World's Exposition in 1867. He saw a model of that. I believe there's a model shown here on the slide in the upper right. I don't know if that's the model he saw. If that's something looks like something more contemporary. And now the next slide, please, Merle. This is also a picture. That's probably a diagram that was in fact shown at the World's Fair. Plunger used compressed air cylinder to turn a screw. So it was the first submarine that actually got away from muscle power. It gave it about a 5 mile range at 4 knots, which was massive for the day. So to Verne, writing about his submarine Nautilus, that was so much larger, he probably thought it was huge, what he was writing about compared to anything that had come before. But in fact, what Verne wrote, the exterior dimensions don't match his interior dimensions, and everything he writes about being inside the Nautilus couldn't possibly fit inside the Nautilus. Next slide, then. Okay. He describes, in terms of the Nautilus, many palatial rooms. So a library with 12,000 volumes, a huge study that's stuffed with specimens, an enormous captain's mess, a very sizable stateroom, that dimensions that he gives that Aronnax was placed in. They're largely empty. He said Aronnax could go for days without seeing another crewman other than his steward. And Aronnax never, in the book, never talks about how big the Nautilus crew was. Aronnax doesn't know himself. Personally, I've never been in a submarine as small as the Nautilus. I've been to sea in about 20 different submarines of various classes. And one thing any submariner would comment on is how your elbow to elbow and alone time in space is very, very rare. So they're crowded little spaces. So either Verne didn't actually put together 2 and 2, what's the interior volume of the ship that I designed, because he clearly could calculate it. He knew how big the ship was inside from the displacement. Or he decided to waive that and stated a submarine of dimensions that would be credible but very, very large, considered believable at the time, while then discussing in true fashion as an adventure writer, an interior that's plush and also adventurous, without recognize the fact that those two didn't go together. That makes him an adventure writer more than a science fiction writer in this regard. And in fact, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is considered one of the greatest adventure stories of all time. The Hollywood movie kind of focuses on the conflict that was lying in the background and the imprisonment of Aronnax and his people. But in fact, it's more of an adventure story where 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, in French, it actually was 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, refers to the length of the journey that Aronnax took on board of the ship. Here we show, actually shows it to be rather small. This is Captain Nemo on the main deck taking a sighting, and they discuss this platform that he's standing on a lot. When they spend a lot of time on the surface, that thing would, any open ocean location, it would be very hard to stand at a platform like that and not get washed over. So next slide then. And see, these are some of the original graphic artwork that went into the original book. We show the study on the left, which has a number of marine specimens and samples that all taxidermy or whatever that could be studied. The interior library. Look how tall that overhead is. There are very few spaces in any submarine I've been in where you could see that far or see an overhead that high. And the engineering space is on the right. He's kind of vague on the engineering. We'll talk about that in a slide or two. In fact, next slide. Next slide, Merle. Thank you. Okay. We'll talk about the engineering. He identifies that electric power propels the Nautilus. And he identifies correctly that electric propulsion is the key to the submarine's future. He has the Nautilus powered by sodium-mercury batteries, from which he says only the sodium is consumed in the electric reaction. He treats it as if the electrolyte is in fact replaced instead of those batteries recharged, because he has nothing on board the ship that will recharge those batteries. Those batteries are charged at his secret base at an island in the Azores. And he, in fact, moves the Nautilus into that island to replace electrolyte. And the electrolyte is made by burning undersea coal at the Nautilus mines. And he doesn't go into that process, doesn't describe it, but he has some way off depictions of the kind of endurance that he'd get out of doing that. Nautilus will pull into the Azores, replace its electrolyte, and then sail around the world before it comes back and gets the battery recharged. Now, batteries don't do that. So he's kind of off base in what kind of things that would be feasible in that manner. He has Nautilus capable of 50. He calls it 53 miles an hour. I suspect the original French was probably kilometers per hour, but I worked that out to 43 knots. That's a very, very fast submarine. And I'm not sure he realizes also what kind of drag that would create and what type of power that would consume. Next slide. Okay, and like I was talking, he's vague on the engineering, other than say that the Nautilus is powered by sodium and zinc battery. He'll only get electrolyte recharge at the Azores. He has his secret base in a deserted island in a volcano that was hollowed out by natural forces, and that Nautilus could enter. That was pretty much as depicted in the original Disney movie in the 1950s. They did a good job being true to the story that way. Next. Yeah, here's a surface base, a secret base, and this is the Nautilus showed in the interior of this hollowed out volcano. Next. Okay, just some tidbits as far as the science and technology of the day. A quote is, at least in the English translation, in this regulated temperature, we didn't even have to worry about catching colds. Now, germ theory of infectious disease, when he wrote this, was still not widely accepted in what passed for medical circles. They thought you could catch a cold by being in cold temperatures, and you wouldn't necessarily get a cold if the temperature was 75 instead of 65. Nautilus knew of an underwater tunnel connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. At this point, the Suez Canal was being dug, and they discussed how the Suez Canal was being dug, but Nautilus could transit from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean underground. He has a constant current flowing from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean so fast that Nautilus couldn't overtake it, so she couldn't get back from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, but she went one way. I just thought that was interesting. I think it would collapse. Any such thing would collapse, but I thought it was interesting to discuss that possibility. He discusses, of course, what the Suez Canal is going to do for international trade. He's pretty accurate in that regard. There was another discussion that caught my interest. He said Aronnax was lecturing, saying volcanoes had been plentiful in the first days of the world, but going extinct as the Earth cools. That there are fewer volcanoes now than there were earlier. Verne was probably in a day when most people felt the Earth was about 5,000 years old. He doesn't seem to address that anywhere in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that I saw. But one day Earth will be frozen because the sun isn't powerful enough to heat a corpse. This idea that the Earth's heat is coming from inside instead of from the sun, I don't know where he got that. It seems counterintuitive. Now, he had no idea of what the real source of the Earth's interior heat, which is radioactive decay, really is. And with a concept of the Earth being a few thousand years old, the fact that we've been cooling this whole time, so the Earth still hasn't cooled yet, when there's no internal heat source, would have been reasonable to him. But not understanding that the sun is going to keep is the primary source heating the Earth's surface. I found that just bizarre. Now, he had no idea of E equals mc squared. We'll discuss that again with H.G. Wells in The World Set Free and Einstein's relativity theory. So he had no idea of understanding that the sun is and will be heating us for billions of years yet to come. Go ahead. Next
So
slide.
we have a question.
Yes. I don't remember. I'm sorry. I'd have to look into my notes. But okay. Now there's some idea about sea control and pressure. He describes ballast tank flooding and emptying, all technically feasible, but in fact there were submarines out there that would have to do that kind of thing. So that wasn't a stretch for him. He was absolutely accurate in his numbers about the submarine size and its displacement. His numbers all fit. Archimedes, as I say, Archimedes would be content. He talks about how Nautilus displacement changes with pressure changes, with temperature changes, all entirely accurate. He understood that very nicely. But there's no apparent recognition of the effects of pressure and depth. He knows the numbers. He knows that when Nautilus went deeper, it's exposed to greater external pressure, but he didn't seem to grasp or talk about what effects that would be. He talks about, in fact, Nautilus having reached a depth of 33,000 feet depth. That's incredible pressure. You need a very, very high, specially designed submersible to do that. I think there's one submersible we have today that could. The original was probably 10,000 meters depth, but for what it's worth, it's unrealistic to describe a submarine that could do that. It's not specially meant to it. I got the impression he thought that he was right, that in fact, depth excursions for Nautilus below 6,500 feet were rare, but that's still a terrifying pressure to be at. Next slide. There were a number of EVAs, external vehicular activities, using a diving suit, and he's quite advanced in describing that technology. He doesn't know, of course, scuba or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus won't be developed until the 1940s. At the time, diving was done by the type of suit he describes, but with air hoses feeding a constant supply of air to it. The people he described still walk along the bottom. He describes the backpack tank they're wearing, charged at 700 psi. That probably sounded high to him, like a large pressure to try to expect to contain within a metal volume. But in fact, even shallow, that would last about a half hour today, and we would know that. Verne says his endurance underwater was 9 to 10 hours. Those numbers don't work. The endurance, in fact, would be dependent on your depth. The diver is exposed to sea pressure externally. Verne didn't realize that, but one lungful of air that you draw out of your tanks at 33 feet depth is twice the actual air as the lungful taken at the surface. And so the deeper you go, the shorter your duration would be, and he didn't appear to recognize that. The group underwater, they got tired on a long EVA, hours long, and they took a nap underwater. As an advanced open water diver myself, I don't think any diver would think it's a good idea to intentionally fall asleep underwater. You're not likely to wake up again. Now, Verne has a underwater depth excursion reaching at least 500 feet depth with these divers outside. They're exposed to external pressure in those diving suits, and that would be lethal without a gas mix that reduced the oxygen and nitrogen concentrations. He didn't understand any of that. Nobody had actually attempted diving to those depths at that point, so that was not understood. Now, the underwater rifles that he has, I know Disney had these being charged electric guns, but these were basically air rifles that shot taser rounds with lethal charges. So Verne could be said to have invented the concept of the taser, only it was a lethal device for fighting off sharks and other undersea, what he treated as monsters. That would be interesting. Next slide. And a few. Here's the diving suit on the left, and as they're putting it on, you can see the backpack that contained what would have been an insufficient quantity of air for what he describes them doing, and they wouldn't have the endurance to reach the depths he describes in the book. In the middle, they're salvaging a sunken treasure convoy. Nautilus did frequently gather treasures, riches from the deep. Nemo had certain people and causes he liked to support, and he handed off these treasures to them. He's described himself as a champion of the downtrodden. It's not explicit in the book as published what his problem was with humanity. The drafts indicated that he was in fact a Polish national, the draft manuscripts. whose family was killed by the Russians in 1863. That's what drove him to create the Nautilus and to separate himself from mankind. And the ongoing fight he had was with the Russians. That was removed in editing because at the time France was an ostensible ally with the Russians, and they found that that was convenient to the time. So he made Nemo a more mysterious character. And in fact, when they transitioned Nemo to the character to Nemo to being East Indian in Mysterious Island, they changed his entire nature there. But as far as the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he was originally going to be a Polish aristocrat who hated the Russians. On the right, we have Atlantis with a volcano. The lost city in the Atlantic, and the volcano is still active. Verne has some unrealistic things about underwater volcanoes, that they actually erupt like that instead of, as we've seen from underwater footage, almost immediately cooling. And he has at one point Nautilus sailing through a part of the ocean where it's nearly boiling because they're near a volcano. The volcanoes aren't that powerful. Okay, and next slide. Okay, and I think we're back to you with these to discuss these, Merle.
Now, the one thing I want to point out, Verne is a really good example of this, and we see this throughout the whole period. Okay, let me put my picture back on the screen.
Put your camera back up.
Yeah, put my camera back up. I've got to do this on 3 screens. Give me a second. 1, 2, 3, boom.
Did we lose Elizabeth, or did you?
No, we tried to provide focus for the people that were speaking, so I wanted to be sure that we did that. Elizabeth's still lurking in the background. I can see her. She's almost doing tisk, tisk, tisk in the corner. All right, just for that. I'll put her back on because she's far cuter than we are. Although I don't want to make that an issue either. She's awful bright. Anyway, Paris in the 20th Century, it was basically written as a story of Verne's vision of 1960. And it was written in 1863, but it wasn't published till 1994, 1996 in English. And it's a dystopian view of the future. But the thing I wanted to point out before I get to that is, what we need to understand in the whole period is the science fiction part of the story is the picture frame. It's designed to create novelty. It's designed to create excitement. And almost everything else it's the cover for the social or moral or intellectual debate that the writer wants to make. Now, there's some of that goes on in fantasy as well. So there's a lot of potential for overlap, and maybe we'll do a fantasy version of this at some point and talk about how it influenced things. But the thing to understand is Verne tried to take something plausible and use it as the picture frame to talk about deeper issues. And Paris in the 20th Century is a real good example of this. What was interesting is its publisher did not want him to publish it because he thought it would be unpopular. And Verne had just been at the height of his popularity with the balloon story. Okay, get back over here. All right. But the thing that's interesting is he has a lot of predictions. Now, keep in mind, this is 1863. And if we go back to the technology chart, okay, that we looked at, the very first description of escalators, the first patent for escalators was 1863. So Verne didn't quite know that was available, but he basically put escalators in his story. He's got cars with internal combustion engines. He's got gasoline stations. He's got paved asphalt roads, elevated and underground train systems, including magnetic and compressed air power for them, skyscrapers, electric lights through a whole city. That was not in the picture at the time. Picture telegraphs that worked like faxes, so you could take your picture and write a note and send it off. Primitive computers that could send messages, wind power, automated security systems, the electric chair, yes. Remotely controlled weapons. Does this sound like today? I mean, he's got a lot of stuff in there. And basically weapons that were bad enough to make war unthinkable, which is something that Wells talks about too in his own stories. His career, now we're moving to Wells. But Paris in the 20th Century was particularly an interesting book, and I think it would have been groundbreaking if it had been printed in the era, but it was totally different than any of his other stuff. Most of his other stuff was light adventure, and this was like, oh my gosh, where's the world coming to? Because one of the underlying parts of the story here is what you see in a lot of Wells stuff. It's the class struggle aspect of what's going on in Elizabeth and Victorian society, and in both France and England and throughout the intellectual circles of Europe. Now Wells. Wells' career didn't hit stride until 1895. Now notice, there's a big gap there. There's a 30 some odd year gap because they're really different generations. Wells' first really big hit was The Time Machine. And he did a lot of stuff that was a lot more progressive. He did a lot of science research, did a lot of reading. He's also one of the first well-known war gamers for his Little Wars game, for those of you that are into that. Now, he had a really entirely different kind of background. He was primarily educated and interested in science, where Verne took that on as his avocation because they were grooming him for the law. So Wells was born in 1866. And he was basically apprenticed as a draper and went to an English grammar school and was so good in his English and his Latin lessons and so on, they made him an instructor. And he became an instructor, moved around between a number of different schools, and eventually moved into science and got a college degree in zoology. He supplemented his income as a writer for journals, and a lot of those originally were scientific type things. And he was sort of a heavy socialist. He was very bohemian. He slept around. He had lots of intellectual friends. He moved in all those kinds of social circles. And he basically came up with what we now call Wells' Law. You write your story by instilling commonplace detail along some single extraordinary assumption, what he called the plausible impossible. Okay, so things that came out of his different stories. I mean, we've got genetic science with the Island of Dr. Moreau. We've got laser weapons with the War of the Worlds, biological warfare with War of the Worlds, air warfare. He talks about the sexual revolution, suburbs, moving walkways, a federalized Europe. Sound familiar, anyone? Okay, and an atomic bomb in 1913. So he had some awareness of the research on atomics at that point, and wireless communication. So now we're going to move to some specific stories, and we're going to shift to Mark on the Time Machine.
Okay, I actually used some of the imagery from the Disney movie in 1960 because the imagery is pretty good, although they changed some things about it, including outlandishly sexualizing the character of Weena here. Next slide then. In the Time Machine, we have, as Merle was saying, one hypothesis of a time machine built on the world as every reader would have recognized it. Everything else was the same, but then there's this time machine, so everybody says, okay, one thing I have to accept and move on from there. In the book, the inventor was never named. The book was, as in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Aronnax, a first-person narrative of his experience. The inventor himself is never named, though he's named in the movies. He uses this time machine to go forward in time. So he investigates a possible human future in his terms. The discussion is more social than technological. We can't draw a lot, and I know this presentation is about the future as seen from the 19th century, what they got right, what they got wrong. But there's not too much to talk about technology in the future, since he doesn't describe future technology. He describes a future in which technology is broken down. So nothing to see here. Next, Merle. In the future, he hypothesized 800,000 years in the future, mankind is evolved into two different species, the Eloi and the Morlocks. They're both descended from humans. The backstory, as it comes out, is a long-term separation between privileged and proletarian classes. Not natural disasters or the man-made disasters as described in both movies. And this is Verne's Wells' social comment as a one-worlder and a socialist, that the human race continued to have the privileged class staying in their nice, luxurious surroundings, their mansions topside, where the machinery and ultimately the workers to the proletarian class that ran society got pushed deeper and deeper underground into their basements, and ultimately they became narrowly focused. They learned how to keep doing their one job and not think about anything else, while the people on the surface became more and more useless at doing anything at all. Ultimately, some natural disaster that's not depicted brought everything down around their heads, and it turned out the people on the top side couldn't do anything. The working class and the ugly machinery, ugly lives underground could at least keep the machinery running. They realized that they were the people in charge now. So it ended up being more of a, as depicted in the movie, a cannibalistic society, where the backward, brutal Morlocks preyed upon the useless Eloi. So that's it. Next slide. Okay, so Wells' nature as a socialist is coming through. Perhaps also his rearing in English society, which is more stratified than American society, especially in the Victorian era. It would not recognize that the society would be addressing some of these class differences in the future through labor movements, unions, laws, strikes, socialism, social programs, and that the balancing of the classes was going to be taking place. It might be slow. There will still be a lot of stratification. We're not used to that in America, but there is still more stratification in English society. But for what it's worth, the type of proletarian getting pushed down to the basements where they're out of sight and out of mind of the privileged class hasn't happened, and I suspect ever will. So at the end, the time traveler meets the Eloi. He has a confrontation with the Morlocks. He comes out ahead of that, and he ends up moving far forward in time at the end of the book, after toward the end of his adventure, when he ends up breaking from the Eloi and breaking from the Morlocks. He describes he sees the sun moving quickly through the sky, flashing through the sky, but it slowly slows and ends up sitting there as he's moving forward, hundreds of years at a time. In a second, the sun is just sitting there stationary. As he describes the Earth becoming tidally locked, and he describes the sun swelling into a red giant. That's all very interesting. I don't believe the Earth can ever become tidally locked to the sun. We're too far out. But he understood about red giants, and the astronomers did. And he said he said he'd gone 40 million years into the future. Reality is that he's probably talking about the sun's red giant phase is probably going to be closer to 4 billion years in the future. At that point, relativity theory was not developed, of which E equals mc squared is not a consequence, and no scientist at the time understood what the power source of our sun was and how it could in fact continue to burn as it is for billions of years. So longevity is not understood by science when he wrote that. Next slide. Just some gratuitous pictures. The Hollywood Morlocks, and on the left is 1860, and on the right is 2002. Again, the 1960 movie and the 2002, and I couldn't refrain from putting in the Big Bang Theory kids who bought one of those stage props from the time machine. They thought they were buying a model, and this huge thing ended up in their living room. But they had a lot of fun with it at the time. And now the really gratuitous pictures. The Weena character in the book is not a sexual being. No, insofar as the time traveler was concerned, it was much more of a father-daughter relationship. She was an adult, but he said he couldn't recognize the male from the female Eloi. They had evolved so much, he didn't recognize male from female, presumably when they had their clothing on. The Eloi were childlike creatures, and they played and frolicked a lot. And you got the impression, as much as he could write in the Victorian era, that was a lot of sexual play there too. But for what it's worth, he did not see his Weena as a sex object. She was more of a father-daughter relationship. The Eloi were small, and he would walk around with her on his shoulders. But to him, he wasn't entirely human. But the Hollywood, of course, brought in Yvette Mimeo in 1960. She was a sex symbol at the time. The only reason you bring in Yvette Mimeo is to have a character on board that the male watchers will drool over. And of course, Samantha Mumba in 2002. Despite the exotic names, Yvette Mimeo was born in Los Angeles, and Samantha Mumba in Dublin, and she is best known as a singer and songwriter. they named her character Mara, but she was the same Weena character. And romance was not among his reasons to incentives to try to return. In the book, Weena dies, and he is not able to save her from the Morlocks. Next slide. Okay, probably back to you now, Merle.
Yeah. Yay, I'm back. Okay. So The Island of Dr. Moreau was done in 1896. And what's interesting about this from a sci-fi perspective is it really talks about someone trying to deal with genetic change. It has the theme of the mad scientist and man interfering with nature, which follows the theme that Mark was talking about earlier. A lot of science fiction is, we can do it, but should we? And what are the ugly consequences? Dr. Moreau was literally, through vivisection, trying to turn beasts into men, and had moved along that path. I mean, the beasts could sing, the beasts knew what the rules were, they sort of followed the rules. There were a variety of mixed creatures like dogmen and gorilla type men, and you know, it's basically an exploration of pain and cruelty, about how much inhumanity we could do in the name of science, and whether there's a moral responsibility, and what really is it to be human. Now, note again, the science is the picture frame to add novelty and excitement to the real underlying moral play that he's got in the story. So there we go. There we go. The next one, The Invisible Man. Now, The Invisible Man's another interesting story, because the original title is Invisible Man, a Grotesque Romance. But there's no real sex-oriented person or image in the story. When you get down to it, the grotesque romance is with the idea of science being the answer. There are a number of interpretations and analysis about this story, but the one I think is most relevant is the one that says this guy basically got so enraptured by science and his idea that he was going to do something nobody else could do, that he basically drove himself mad. I mean, he basically came up with a way to change his body's refractive index to match that of air, and could not reverse it. And the more time that went by, he got more and more involved in drink and drugs and the delusion that science was the answer. And he was struggling to find a way to reverse the process. But along the way, he lost his connection with humanity and became so interested in providing for himself through random and irresponsible violence. I mean, he set fire to his boarding house, he robbed people, he murdered people. Basically, he started swearing revenge against anybody who stood in his way. If you wouldn't let me rob you, I will kill you. And he only became visible again upon his death as part of the end cap to it. The other thing that's interesting is the science is clearly wrong, because Invisible Man would be blind, because eyes absorb light. And if your refractive index of your eyes is that light passes through you, you won't be able to see anything. I love that picture that I found too. And now we're back to the War of Worlds and Mark.
Okay, I found War of the Worlds 1898. I found this picture from the UK Canadian docudrama, The Great Martian War. It's based on H.G. Wells, but they took a lot of World War I footage and put in these tripods into it. And I thought the imagery was great. It looks very much like a turn of the century type of war. The comic book cover on the right, I got excited and had to include that because I had that comic book as a kid. I wish I had it now. But whenever today I think about Martian tripods, I think about the imagery from that comic book. I just thought it was fascinating. But next slide, please. The War of the what hits and misses in the War of the Worlds. Again, we'll talk about. Sorry, move on from that, please. Yeah, that should have been hidden. Sorry, but again, talk about Wells' law and taking one commonplace detail the world as the reader recognizes it. One extraordinary assumption, that is that there are Martians and they land. Martians attack Earth as Earth was at the time of the writing. So there's not much to say technologically about what his hits and misses are, since the story takes place in the current day, as in 1898, with no human advances depicted. He misses, of course, that Mars is uninhabitable. He says it's home to an ancient sentient species, technologically advanced compared to Earth. The hit that Mars destroyed Martians were destroyed by Earth germs against which they had no tolerance. To him, that's quite a twist. Remember, Verne didn't seem to understand or accept the germ theory of infectious disease, while to H.G. Wells, we're surrounded by things that at the price of 1 billion lives, we've earned our immunity, but the Martians had none. He recognized that did what all human machinery and war machines could not do, destroyed the Martians. I have to ask why the technologically superior Martians didn't see that coming and take some type of precautions against it, though. Next slide. And just again, some gratuitous pictures. The Hollywood movie and the more recent remake. Now, the next book I'd like to talk about is The World Set Free. It was written in 1912, 1913, published in 1914, a handful of months before the outbreak of World War I. I know we talked about future seen from the 19th century, but this is, to me, the 19th century really ended in August 1914. So this was published just a few months before the outbreak. Everybody in Europe saw that World War I was coming and basically what was going to be happening. Much of World's book is a narrative, is a narration, absent character dialogue. There are a few characters. The book spans the course of about 50 years. A few characters that he develops in some dialogue, but a lot of it is him talking about what the future is. So this book is largely his description of future held or should hold in store, and his lecture to us is how things should go. Wells' theme, human history is the history of mastery of power and energy through technological advance. How one individual can continue to do more and more and more with every few hundred years passing by the use of technology. But that brings its own detriment to human progress in the process. We sacrifice things and we give that up. Next slide. In his book, it starts in the current day, which is 1914, with the release of, quote, atomic energy, unquote. Now, E equals mc squared, Einstein's theory of relativity, those things were being debated. There's no reference to it in the book, but certainly H.G. Wells would have understood that at the time. But his harnessing of atomic energy is not what we would in terms of fission chain reaction. That would be up to 1932 when that was first predicted. But his example is that atomic energy is our ability to harness and control radioactive decay. His example is radium. That scientists recognize that radium decay is slow, but it's a tremendous amount of energy released over a period of time based on the size of any particular chunk of radium. And if we can find a way to accelerate that decay, we can harness an incredible energy source. So the book's theme is that mankind learns how to accelerate and control the rate of decay, harnessing the source of limitless free energy. That creates a new second industrial revolution on top of the first one. Next. Now, within a few years, in his story, within 2 years, all cars are backfitted with atomic engines. Now, imagine an atomic engine in a car. That's obviously not the atomic engine we're used to thinking of in terms of a nuclear reactor. But it's smaller, it's lighter, it gives essentially free energy. He talks about driving across Britain for a few pennies. And industry is similarly overhauled. Some industries are plowed under by the new technologies, some wealthy families destroyed, and a lot of social commentary. The book is essentially social commentary on how we need a one world society and a unification of mankind. So the new age of mankind by technology and industrial evolution, however, we do not revamp our political and our educational systems. Next slide. So the world continues to be handled poorly by the politicians, by the technocrats, by the aristocrats, and the industrial class, and the bureaucrats. They will still run the world instead of the scientists who make decisions logically, that ultimately Wells is arguing are the people who should be put in charge. War, quote, war is the inevitable result of the modern state, is a quote from the book. Wells' social commentary on class warfare. There's one character he talks about, and he has World War I breaking out in 1956. Now, it's odd, of course, but he kind of combines our visions of what World War I, World War II, and World War III would all be into one overarching war that destroys mankind. The war is as we would recognize it from 1914, the Central Powers in Europe versus Anglo-French-Russian alliance. World War I only pushed forward. One commentary I wrote said that Wells needed appropriate a period of time to develop his technology that he needed to write the story. So he had to push the war forward to 1956, although everybody in Europe saw it coming. So he talks about one of his central characters when the war breaks out, just before the war is breaking out. His father is wealthy. He was raised as an aristocrat with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he had access to every place in Europe and every place in London. His father loses everything in one of the industrial upheavals brought about by the new technologies and ends up committing suicide. Now the character, now impoverished, talks about how he managed to worm his way onto these streets in London that he normally would have been prevented from walking on because he was no longer considered upper class. That's again Wells' social commentary on the nature of society as he saw it and the problems society had. So in his age, the monarchs are still running things. One of our key contributors to our lecture series talks about how at the beginning of World War I, the monarchs were running things, and at the end of World War I, the industrialists were running things. That's at least one way to view things. Go ahead, Merle. Next slide. So 1956, a world war, as I mentioned, Central Powers, World War I, as everybody saw it coming, 42 years late. Atomic bombs are based on the same radioactive decay technology, and those are central to this war and to destroying. Now, they're not the enormous explosions we know of today associated with nuclear weapons. His atomic bombs are an element called carolinium, which is it's a generic name that would have been applied to some new element. Next slide, please. Carolinium, or lumps of carolinium, explode when they're exposed to air, but it's a continuous explosion. They keep exploding in typical terms, typical high explosives, when they keep exploding for weeks. And they explode for a while until they exhaust the air around them or get covered by something. When you uncover them again, they're exposed to more air and they explode again. Plus, they're giving off deadly radioactive gases. So a handful of carolinium bombs or atomic bombs, as he put it, dropped by airplane on a city or functionally destroy that city, take it out of action for a period of time. The carolinium is supposed to have a 17-day half-life, so never entirely exhausted. Well, I'd say you come back after a few months, you could probably clear that away. But as Wells depicts it, once a city is atomic bombed, the city is gone. To this day, the quote, "To this day, the battlefields and bomb fields of that frantic time in human history are sprinkled with radiant matter and so centers of inconvenient rays," which I think means radiation. Next slide.
So
what do those look like? Fuel air bombs? To me, it's a bomb that lands but keeps going off, keeps exploding. There's this constant explosion at that site. It's hard for me to imagine what that looks like. But that's what he was describing. We'll talk about the atomic bombing of Berlin. Early in the first phases of the war, the Germans bomb Paris, and the French respond by atomic bombing Germany. And this is amusing. It's people's vision of air warfare before it actually started. In 1956, this bomber takes off from France to go bomb Berlin. It is a monoplane, but it's a two-seat monoplane, open cockpit. Great. They fly, and it's propeller driven, but an atomic engine is powering that. So they fly to Berlin. They are jumped as they're approaching Berlin. They jump by German defending aircraft, which are also two-seat monoplanes, open cockpit. The fighter being a sniper in the back, who's shooting at the bomber. So that's I just thought that was interesting. The bomber pilot managed to evade the defenders, and the backseater picks the atomic bombs up off the floor at his feet and rolls them over the side. So that is Wells' vision of atomic war as conducted in 1956. I thought that was very amusing. So, but if you recognize that Wells really is trying to talk about World War I the way it's upcoming, he just had to advance artificially the date to make it seem that society industrially had made a major change. That kind of makes sense. People were, and in fact, the first air combat were snipers shooting at each other in 1914, and the first bombs through most of World War I were bombs being slung out of the cockpit. Okay, next slide. Out of the destruction of the war, a Council of Nations is held. Monarchs give up, abdicate their power to this Council of Nations. The introduction of atomic energy in a world divided resulted in the collapse of society, but their choice was, as stated by Wells, either to return to agriculture or barbarism or acceptance of achieved science as the basis of a new social order. British king abdicates in favor of the world state to set an example, and all world government is presented as Wells' solution to the threat of nuclear weapons or atomic weapons. To be quick, war makes it. Next slide. Quotes from the book. Certainly, it seems now that nothing could have been more obvious to the people of the early 20th century when Wells was writing than the rapidity with which war was becoming impossible. Certainly they did not see it. They should have seen it, but they saw that it didn't. They did not see it until the atomic bombs burst in their fumbling hands. Although through the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of energy that man was able to command, again going back to Wells' initial statements at the opening of the book, that human technology advancement was about harnessing greater and greater energies and powers. Was increasing, applied to warfare. That meant that the power to inflict a blow, the power to destroy, was continually increasing, and there was no increase whatever in the ability to escape. Destruction was becoming so facile that any little body of malcontents could use it. It was a matter of common knowledge that a man could carry about in a handbag an amount of latent energy sufficient to wreck half a city. And that's pretty intriguing that he'd start to draw those conclusions without actually understanding nuclear weapons the way we understand them today. But he saw the increase.
Backpack nukes.
Yeah, that's in the malcontents, the potential for weapon of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists. Sounds more like the kind of thing he was getting at.
So we had a question from the last slide.
No, there was no mention of anti-aircraft or any type of defenses other than the I would call them fighters. I don't think that term had been developed yet, but defending aircraft with snipers. Okay, next slide. So, as an interesting aside, it may have his book may have affected the actual progress of atomic power. Physicist Leo Szilard read the book in 1932, the year before the neutron was discovered in 1933, and he was the scientist who first conceived the idea of a nuclear chain reaction, filed patents for it. So it might have affected his thinking as well. Although if he actually grasped the idea of the book, maybe he should have said, I shouldn't be going down this path. All right, next slide.
Okay, so now we're moving back to the generic topic of science fiction in the era. Give me a second to add myself back in. There we go. Okay, so this is the pretty much the start of the 19th century science fiction movement. And although we spent a lot of time on Verne and Wells, that's important because they are by far the most influential in the process. But what we also want to talk about is how this all fits in context and who else was out there. Now, there's a lot of debate on exactly how far what you want to include is science fiction versus fantasy. And my basic criteria as I built this was it has to have some scientific basis based on what they're talking about. I mean, there were a lot of people that had stories that were purely fantastic that talked about telekinesis or whatever, but they didn't explain it by science. Okay, so I left those kinds of authors out, but there are dozens of authors in various languages. Now, the other thing to realize is when we talk about science fiction in America, we're very Eurocentric. All our roots are from the European intellectuals during the Victorian era. There were a few exceptions to that. There was at least one significant Indian author, but that's part of the British Empire, so that's still sort of Eurocentric. We don't really have a lot of references for Japan, China, or these other places where there could have been other people doing similar stories. So keep in mind, right now, we're looking at it through a focused prism that only includes certain things. Now, Shelley's story and Shelley's background is really interesting because Shelley was born in 1797 and she had a really rich informal education, but she's like 19 years old when she comes up with the idea for this story. Now, she's also dating and pregnant by a major romantic poet and philosopher who was married to somebody else at the time, and they did a retreat to Lake Geneva, sort of very much the bohemian intellectual movement, because it's like free sex and love and science and all that. But basically, they had a bunch of people they were with, and she was challenged to write a ghost story. So she came up with this idea of using the Galnavic principles to create an artificial man. So the story was building a man from non-living matter. It was planned that this guy was going to be really beautiful, but he turned out with watery white eyes and visible blood vessels, and he got away and eventually became literate and articulate. See, what's happened here is we've used the science as an excuse for the morality play that we're going to run it through. He returns and demands his creator makes him a mate, okay, and then frames his creator for murder. The overarching theme is that cutting-edge science maybe can make something, but it shouldn't. And what are the unforeseen consequences? Okay, so that's really particularly drawn out because he talks about what have I done, okay? Now, she also did one other piece of science fiction, which was called The Last Man in 1826, which was a dystopian apocalyptic war with a pandemic, okay? And she talks about how mankind was inadequate to fight against nature, which is really kind of interesting to note, and suggested that medicine was too timid and too late to save the world. So in the world that we're in today with the global COVID crisis, it's really interesting to see this was predicated in something she looked at that early. I just thought that was kind of remarkable as I got into the research. Now I'm moving to other authors that did science fiction-ish stories. This particular guy was Secretary of State for the Colonies in his lifetime, and was a very famous author, coined a lot of interesting phases, which I think you might want to go back and look at. The Great Unwashed, The Pursuit of the Mighty Dollar, It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. How many times have we heard those? Okay. The Dweller on the Threshold were things, but he basically was following the theme of the Hollow Earth. His story was about a subterranean race that evolved psychic powers. This is very Darwinian, because Darwin stuff is starting to come out about this period from his journeys. And the idea was that these people were going to be able to transmit information, get rid of pain, and make others going to sleep. And the underlying meta theme was they're out to destroy humanity because they're better than us and think that we're something less. Interesting view. Jane Webb Loudon is another one. She was a multilingual daughter of an industrialist born in 1807, and she wrote The Mummy, the original Mummy story, which was a future science fiction story. They brought back Sios Mummy, okay, into England in 2126, which was a Catholic monarchy with female succession. It was a parody of Frankenstein and liberalism, and surgeons and lawyers were all robots. I like that part. Hair ornaments were colored flame and controlled flame. You had like a neon tube with controlled flames around your head. Women wore trousers. They had instant messaging, only it came by cannonball delivery, and you fired the cannonball, and it got caught in the net, and you had the note. It was kind of interesting. Weather control and balloon carriages, okay?
Damn, autocorrect.
Yeah, really. Very interesting. Yeah, don't get away with autocorrect. The cannonball will get you. But she eventually became a horticulturist, and that was her only science fiction novel. Nicolas Camille Flammarion, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, French scientist. This is a guy who was an astronomer, okay? But he was also a mystic. He was a Darwinist, okay? And basically wrote two important science fiction novels that were related, Real and Imaginary Wars and Lumen, or Worlds and Lumen. And basically in both of those, they had a journeyer, a traveler that went and discovered extraterrestrial life and saw the range of exotic species. It was all about the transmigration of souls. But one of the interesting science parts of it is he started talking about difference in perception from traveling beyond the speed of light. What I thought was particularly interesting, got my attention, is he was translated into English by Brian Stableford. And if you don't know who Brian Stableford is, you cannot be a proper science fiction fan. Okay. Edward Sylvester Ellis. This one's more a novelty, But this is also interesting when you think about the history of modern literature and science fiction. This guy was a teacher who wrote more than 159 books. And he was the first guy who was selling popular dime novels in America. Okay, so he had a whole series of stories about this teenager who was a tinkerer who built a steam-powered man that carried him across the prairie for adventures. So it's a kid's young adults novel, okay, with this steam man, which there's no real good explanation of how he got fuel on the prairie, but we don't want to go there. But the guy was also best known for his Deerfoot novels, which were all about a Shawnee warrior. This is more the novelty story and the sci-fi part, but the thing that's interesting is you see again, the science is the excuse to tell the other story. Okay. Edward Bulwer Lytton, born in 1803. This is, I went backwards, didn't I? I wasn't supposed to do that, or else I duplicated it. Okay. Robert Louis Stevenson, this is a good one. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was on TV just this last week again, one of the old black and whites with Spencer Tracy known as, okay? This guy created stories from 7, and his first hit was Treasure Island. And 3 years later, he follows up with The Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll's body physically is transformed, okay, by mad science, okay? This was a guy who was basically, created a version of himself that was evil, self-indulgent, and uncaring about anybody else. Initially, he thought he could control it, but then he started changing involuntarily. And in the same mad scientist tradition, it's like, what have I done? Yeah. So the other thing is, this is a template that I got from a public site, and it's provided free as long as I accredit it, so I did. All right. So that's our primary presentation, and I'm going to shift here in a second. Let me hide a couple things and get fancy on you, because I'll bring up the other presentation, which is the one that Elizabeth has put up, which is to give us a perspective on how 19th century science fiction affected the more modern period, and particularly JPL, the Jet Propulsion Labs. So give me just a second to do the screen management, and we'll be back in business. And boom, 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 and boom. Take it away, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Elizabeth Kapurki. Among other things, I do STEM and STEAM outreach, presenting robotic spaceflight to my community. One of the things I volunteer as a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, and I love to talk about the history of the early history of the rocket program and the early history of JPL in the US. And when researching that, especially looking at the life of Jack Parsons, you can't not talk about early science fiction. So next slide, please. Merle? Thanks. Cool. So one thing that comes up is that how popular the book From the Earth to the Moon was. So a little bit about who I'm talking about. Jack Parsons, aka John Whiteside Parsons, grew up in the early 20th century in California and was a self-taught chemist and one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Lab that became part of NASA. When you look at his early biography, he read From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Now, the interesting thing is that Verne did not talk about rockets. As one of the earliest slides in this presentation said, he talked about ballistics. So the story From the Earth to the Moon is briefly about a gun club that was excited to make a giant cannon and send several people to the moon, and then they orbit the moon. But this inspired a lot of people who were thinking about rockets. But the thing about rockets in the early 20th century is that the common perception was that they would not work in space. That the truth is, they are more efficient. They are third law of motion machine. Certainly, rocketry was a technology that was known, going back for a very long time, gunpowder propulsion in China, and tried a little bit in warfare, but not early on in Europe, but not really embraced yet. So when you're talking the 20s, the 10s, 20s, and 30s, the people who were interested in rockets were those weirdos who were also interested in science fiction, because science fiction was also very, very marginalized at this time. I also had a picture of Amazing Stories. I believe the date here on this first issue was 1926. I put it in this issue, in this presentation, because it's advertising publishing stories by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. So when a young Jack Parsons also met someone named Ed Foreman, one of the things they bonded over was their love of science fiction and their hope to start experimenting with rockets. Next slide, please. So eventually they convinced the visionary professor Theodor von Karman at Caltech to let them work with one of his grad students, Frank Molina, and to have a little bit of resources to start setting up rocket experiments. So this is sometimes called the nativity scene of JPL. And on the man on the right is Jack Parsons, Molina and Foreman are there, and two other people. So they're setting up an early rocket engine to test. Next slide, please. Here is one of, and here's Frank Molina's drawings of the system. We have some oxygen tanks, some nitrogen tanks, and they were setting this up in a dry arroyo outside of Pasadena. I forget if I said this was 1936. Next slide. It eventually worked. And Jack Parsons started talking about rocketry to various interested people. And at the time, again, some of the people who were taking this seriously in the US were science fiction fans. So the LI Science Fantasy Society is the oldest running science fiction fan club. On the left is a photo from their clubhouse. This was not something they had at the time when Jack Parsons got involved, but very early on, he presented about the science fact of rocketry to an audience that included a young Ray Bradbury. Bradbury had also been influenced by Verne and Wells. So one of my intents here is to sort of trace a story of influence and inspiration, not claiming that it comes from any single source, but to see the way that these things relate to each other. Ray Bradbury went on to write Fahrenheit 451 and also The Martian Chronicles. And although he described that as more like fantasy and almost at one point like Greek myth, certainly the imagery, it drew inspiration from imagery of Mars and continued to fuel public interest and imagination about Mars. Next slide. So this is from 1956. The interesting thing about the Jet Propulsion Lab, it's a little bit of a weird word, and it actually comes from a time when it was so weird, and if you were talking about rockets, it wouldn't look like you knew what you were talking about. So they got a contract with the Army at the time to provide rockets for a jet-assisted takeoff and provide little rocket engines. But at the time, they were actually providing jet propulsors. So the name stuck long after this was no longer an issue and long after people like Braun were brought over. But this is from 1956, setting up one building a few buildings in the dry arroyo. Next slide. And here's where it is now. My partner jokes about this photo. Is that a crater that was caused by an experiment gone wrong? No, it is not. The Jet Propulsion Lab ended up, they did After Jack Parsons' death, which was an accident, and it was an explosion while he was working on some special effects. Oh, the rest of his life is very, very interesting. Talking about with Wells and Shelley and some of the bohemian aspects of their community. Can definitely also see that from Parsons and some of the people he's hanging out with. So, highly recommend looking into that. But later on, they did eventually. The people he worked with, they did eventually make a sounding rocket, which was the kind of the initial plan. And then eventually, JPL, as part of NASA, got responsibility for the robotic spaceflight part of NASA's portfolio. So I'm going to talk about this at the end. I'm going to talk about this evening. But when you hear about Voyager and you hear about the Curiosity rover and you hear about the Perseverance rover that was just launched, all of those are from the Jet Propulsion Lab, and all of those are robotic exploration of space, not human exploration of space. Next up, please. And the cool thing is that this interplay of science fiction and science fact and inspiration continues. The Mars Phoenix lander, which was a JPL mission to Mars's North Pole, carried a digital copy of the Martian Chronicles. Next slide. And Ray Bradbury died in 2012. I believe August 2012, the Curiosity rover landed on Mars, and the landing site was named Bradbury Landing in his honor. And you can see here there's scour marks towards the back. That was the rocket engines of the sky crane that lowered Curiosity to the surface. She came down with her wheels touching down, so could basically do some characterization and then start driving. And you can also see some of her tracks, the tracks for a rover on another world. And this was processed by the image processor Damia Buick. Next slide. And so finally, Jack Parsons' big invention was a solid rocket fuel. Potentially, one speculation is that it was inspired by stories of Greek fire and his longtime interest in mythology. That solid rocket technology shows up in Minuteman missiles, in the solid rocket boosters of the space shuttle, and continues to be used recently. So this is a photo of the Atlas V rocket from ULA on the launch pad that went up 2 days ago. So finishing up the story of the interplay of influence. And thank you. And I'll take questions or comments or whatever. Come back at 7 p.m. my time Central. That's 8 p.m. Central. 8 p.m. Eastern for my talk on extending our reach of introduction to robotic spaceflight.
Sound, Merle?
Okay.
Elizabeth's talk is a great bookend to demonstrate the connection between the 19th and the 20th century. Basically, what we've tried to show you in this presentation is some of the concepts and ideas that we're dealing with today that show up in science fiction in the 19th century, and that's where most of our science fiction tradition comes from. And essentially, we want to thank you all for coming. Consider coming to our other seminars. We have several more today and 2 tomorrow, and we've added.
We have plenty of time now, so by all means, let's take whatever questions we got.
Absolutely. Anybody have any questions? We're watching the stream.
And do please go into the Gen Con site and redeem your ticket if you haven't already. You can do that to the end of Gen Con, but we know we've had a lot of people watching that we don't have ticket credit for.
Not seeing any else.
I like it. Someone was commenting on the calculations for the cannon and from the Earth to the Moon, and yes, to make that work and not turn people into jelly. Quite a thing.
Yeah,
rockets are better.
And we had a question about, we thought we were going to last till 12:30, and we actually thought we would get lots of questions and from the audience, which is why we figured had booked it for that long. But it looks like we're going to finish early.
right. Thank you. I will see you all at 8.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for helping out, Elizabeth. We'll see you tonight.
And and also our global hotspots at 8 o'clock.
Okay, fantastic, folks. Because we've got 3. We've got one at 6.
There is a question, Richard Hart. What technologies are going into sci-fi today that you think will be duds? Okay, that's
the one I'm
interesting.
most concerned about is the whole space elevator. I'd really like it to work, but I don't think we're going to have the tech to pull it off. Even with carbon fiber stuff, that's a real challenge.
What always bothered me about the space elevator is the space junk that's up there, because you can't deconflict that, and if the thing's 25,000 miles long to reach geosynchronous orbit, which is what the primary plan is going to be, it might be a small target as far as radar cross section, but everything in orbit gets 2 shots on goals on it every orbit, or a shot on goal at every orbit. So I don't think it's very long until it starts to absorb satellites in a traumatic manner. So to me, that's what the big problem with the space elevator is.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of techniques, which is really interesting. But like one of the other things is it depends on your definition of dud, because there are a lot of things that won't be realized because of expense and political will. We are not funding the space program, for example, at the levels we did in the 60s in terms of proportion to the economy. And it's not likely to ever go back to that. The good news, though, is we have a lot of commercial launchers that are trying to reduce the cost of getting into orbit. And once we get all those businesses involved, it will become a lot more interesting, but it's going to be much more chaotic. One of the things that we're looking at for escape velocity is a panel on space law. So that's one of the things that we're likely to partner with them, but that schedule is not final. And that's a good aspect, because the guidelines and international agreements on how non-governments do things in space are not clear. So it's going to be a very Wild West environment.
Hey, I think a lot of our current interest in space it's going to go in a different direction than we actually think. But there's a lot of excitement right now, but I think it's excitement that's driving a lot of investment. When we start to see what the real payoff's going to be, I think some of that's going to slow down, kind of like the way it did in the 70s through the 80s. What I think is not going to be duds, what I think are going to revolutionize things to the extent that we can't really comprehend now, are nanotechnology and high TC superconductivity. They're both going to change. They're both going to change things in ways we can't understand. And of course, artificial intelligence it's by its very nature, we don't understand what it's going to do for us as a species. Star Cops is a likely future. I think we actually ran a game at Origins a couple of years ago that I really enjoyed. The night before, Merle and I were having dinner, saying, "Oh, what are we going to do tomorrow?" And I asked him, "When do you think we're actually going to have space pirates?" And I couldn't sleep that night for all the ideas I had for what we're going to do in this game. We actually ended up with space pirates. We ended up with Somali space pirates that got space pretty quickly. We ended up with conflict, U.S.-Chinese conflict on Mars. With that, and we ended up with Chinese Uyghur separatists that I managed to get a sort of a spacesuit will travel, a second aftermarket space vehicle with which they managed to hijack about $10 billion worth of rare earth metals from a robotic ship that was bringing them back from the asteroid belt after about 10 years of robotic mining out there, and that. The influx of cash into the Uyghur separatist movement dramatically accelerated things. I thought it was a great game. We put together the Texas Space Ranger. He wore a Texas Star that was actually a device for hacking into the network of a space station or other spacecraft in orbit, so that they could get it to open the airlocks to let them in. We put together a 6-shooter, which was recoilless. It fired 6 tiny rockets. But the Chinese developed that technology first, so they put together the strike force of covert operatives in black spacesuits, unmarked, and they became known as the Spacemen in Black. this is all player action based on the
So
tidbits
the other
that
thing
we
to
threw
realize
them.
is we play very serious games in academic environments, but we also customize our games to the convention that we're going to. And we let people have a little bit more leeway when we're dealing with future games at sci-fi conventions, because we can play to pretty much any level.
Mhm. Yeah, the Chinese wanted to develop agriculture on Mars. They tried to species bred things that would work well in the difficult environment, and we put that together with. I told them the first set of pigs they developed, we called it the swine trek, that they were going to be delivering these pigs in space to Mars with. This was hysterical. Okay, Jerry, Robert, any films or TV that you recommend from today's presentation beside the standard classics like War of the Worlds or 20,000 Leagues? Wow, good question.
Well, there are a lot of Frankenstein movies you could recommend, because the thing is, if we confine ourselves to things that were film adaptations of 19th century science fiction, some of the Invisible Man movies are really interesting. There's at least one Island of Dr. Moreau that's kind of interesting, but all of them reinterpret the classic stories.
There's also been plays. Unfortunately, this is going to be hard to find, but there was a spectacular version of Frankenstein done by the Looking Glass Theater in Chicago. And I don't know in these times if they're going to make videos like that available. And I've also heard a radio play performed live of the Island of Dr. Moreau that was done at a steampunk convention.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of. I would certainly be interested if one of these major studios went back and tried to be more true to the original stories in some of these things, even if it's only a rather relative handful of geeks that it appeals to. But I'd certainly be interested in getting back to the time machine with the Eloy that take away the sexualized Weena and just make her a daughter character. The way it was meant to
And
be.
we have the
She was
technology
fascinated
to
with
make
him.
the CGI small people that would work the way the story did.
Well, it was easy enough. No, I would say it's easy enough, but they certainly pulled it off with the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
All right, well, that looks like all of our questions. Any last comments, Mark or Elizabeth? Okay, we're going to let you all go. Thank you very much for joining us. Please join us again and have a safe and happy weekend.
All right. Bye.